Do I know you? It's been a long time. She made a promise to the one she loved, dead now, but no less. A promise. Not one soul more would suffer as he had.
HellBlade 2 is a fascinating game. It is simple and complicated in both typical and unconventional ways. Nearly 8 years have passed since Ninja Theory released HellBlade: Senua's Sacrifice, and a month has now passed since the release of its sequel, Senua's Saga. With so much time passing between one game to the next, one would expect an experience of monumental impact, overwhelming scope, and expansive breadth of content. The press releases of gameplay and story direction have certainly made an impression. Perhaps some of those impressions did not reflect what the game was intended to be. Those who are familiar with the previous entry in this franchise, however, will remember its roots as a crowd-funded, independently developed game. Most indie projects are ultimately limited in what they can deliver, and those clear limitations create an opportunity for creativity that would not present itself otherwise. Nevertheless, HellBlade is no longer an indie franchise, but a well-funded exclusive financed by Microsoft Game Studios. How well does this game succeed as a sequel? Has the long wait been rewarded with a worthwhile adventure worthy of the work put into it? Does the new Xbox exclusive justify the investment of a $500 gaming machine? Does the big publisher's sponsorship pull the franchise away from its developed identity, or help catapult it into greater realization of its intended vision?
It feels like when you follow your
Ultimately,
destiny.
everyone must answer these questions for themselves. Trying to please everyone will please no one. The game is what it is, and it is called Senua's Saga: HellBlade 2.
Everything I've done has led me to this place. We've come so far. Not far enough. Say it.
The game sets itself apart from its prequel immediately with its opening cutscene, where Senua's Sacrifice began with a foreboding tone, quiet, grim, with a touch of horror, waiting for a build-up of supernatural and superstitious. Senua's Saga begins with a literal bang, derived from a thunderstorm tossing about a vessel housing Vikings and their respective slaves, for which the protagonist is held captive as well. Senua is no longer concerned with the dead, and is now more occupied with preserving the living. She sits patiently, waiting for the opportune moment to execute her plan. That is clearly intended to be a mystery for the audience, but the succeeding moments suggest it might not be clear to Senua either. The theme of uncertainty is exceptionally strong throughout the first half of the narrative. As the story progresses, it is revealed that giants are terrorizing the world of men, and drastic measures are taken to appease them or hide from them. As this crucial plot point becomes clearly exposed, the plot shifts from a fish-out-of-water scenario to a fight for survival, hinging critically on standing up to the giants, and learning whether or not they have any weaknesses. The previous game, as the name suggests, focused heavily on the theme of self-sacrifice and standing alone. The sequel, however, inverts these ideas. Yes, sacrifice is necessary sometimes. Yes, some journeys must be faced alone. Not always, though. Not all solitude is good. Not all sacrifice is noble. Crucial nuances flavor this particular step in Senua's journey. She tries with all her might to carry on as she did at the conclusion of her previous story. Time and again, though, throughout her saga, her limitations reveal themselves to her, her witnesses, and the audience. She is altogether human, a fact made more obviously apparent by her schizophrenia. Constantly throughout her journey, she hears voices, and the shadow that taunted her mercilessly in the first game has not ceased in the second. It overwhelms her, punctuating her constant feelings of inadequacy and desperation. Few games do such an excellent job conveying the humanity of their characters, and this is made more powerful by the vaguely supernatural setting Senua finds herself in. Powerful forces, both material and beyond her comprehension, are working against her, trying to take away her freedom and her life. She is aching, exhausted, on the edge of her life, waiting to be devoured. The most crucial theme of all throughout the story, apparent in every movement she makes, is the will to live, the will to preserve life. This deep wish of hers, this prayer if you will, is what endears her to the other characters she meets throughout her journey. The cast of characters in this story is far greater than the previous game, and the story exploits this to great effect. The inclusion of these new roles in the story more importantly communicate an equally powerful theme alongside the will to live, the strength of unity and standing together. Each new individual Senua bonds with sees the uncompromising empathy she possesses and the strength it gives her. It is irresistible, and because of this, they are drawn to her. The hope she gives them reinforces her hope in kind, monumentally strengthening her resolve, which in turn makes her companions stronger as well. Players who have completed her previous journey will more powerfully appreciate what this means to Senua individually. Watching these events unfold is intimately gripping, compelling the audience to follow her story through to its completion.
Each life lost hangs over her. She feels them on her skin.
Not just another stone. No, something special.
As good as the story may be, it makes no difference if the design of the game isn't solid. Thankfully, the game's design is made with the story in mind, and works to aid the pace set by the dramatic set pieces of each moment. While the Norse setting might tempt its audience to make comparisons to the new God of War games, it's the older PS2 entries that are perhaps more closely related to HellBlade 2. The story is very linear, like in Senua's Sacrifice. Unlike Senua's Sacrifice, the number of ravines and crannies you can discern and fall into are drastically reduced. This is not necessarily a bad thing, as it makes it harder to get lost and definitely aids the pace the story is trying to set for the game. However, the only real freedom players seem to have is to occasionally find a rune or a rock face that builds up to the unlocking of some secrets. But it's not clear what those secrets are. Sure, players get a nice bit of backstory on the mythological elements the game is built around, but it isn't necessarily rewarding to do so. Completionists with the most asinine anal qualities or obsessive-compulsive disorder will probably be the only ones willing to hunt them down. While the linear game with minimal detours design might be off-putting to some, it does at least ensure that the pace of the game is well maintained. Players very frequently move from a narrative exposition sequence to a combat-oriented one, and then to a puzzle, and then to a brief pause between head-scratching and breathing-in action to see some truly breathtaking visual effects few others have incorporated into video games before. Perhaps the only frustrating thing about the game's design is its length. It won't take more than 10 hours for novice players to finish their first playthrough. And while there is some value in replaying the game, it ultimately comes from experiencing the story over again, rather than hunting for secrets or new Game Plus features. The only Game Plus features players can hope to enjoy are from hearing the story retold in the voice of Senua's companions, rather than Senua herself. Aesthetic differences are the only ones audiences can hope to enjoy when replaying this game over again.
They're coming. Smoke.
I bet you really saw it.
While the design of the game is solid, it doesn't make a difference if the gameplay of HellBlade 2 isn't fun. And this is probably the most frustrating aspect of the game. True, it follows the same basic gameplay design as the previous game, but has also narrowed its scope. In Senua's Sacrifice, players could build up to fighting 2, then 3, then even 5 or more enemies at once as they reach the climax of the game. In the sequel, though, players never fight more than one opponent at a time, even in set-piece moments intended to simulate larger skirmishes taking place alongside allies. They kill an enemy and then experience a choreographed death sequence, followed by a brief cutscene before moving on to the next enemy and repeating. It's very hard not to be reminded of the QuickTime events included in older iterations of God of War, or even Ninja Theory's older Heavenly Sword. In fact, Heavenly Sword provides perhaps the best means of comparison for HellBlade 2. Both games feature heroines, both feature mythical settings, both have breathtaking graphics relative to the era they were created in, both throw players down a cattle chute where player freedom is sacrificed to serve the experience it intends to offer. But Heavenly Sword at least still has the old school Devil May Cry hack and slash feeling where players can run out of the way of their enemies, thoughtfully evade, disengage, and otherwise apply an ever-growing level of skill or unorthodox techniques as they become more familiar with the gameplay style. HellBlade 2 allows the player to dodge and initiate a reversal if they time their block correctly, but player freedom doesn't go much further than that. The player's eyes are permanently glued to the one enemy on screen until that enemy is vanquished. They can't disengage or engage a different way. That said, accepting the gameplay rather than fighting against it is the best option. Taking the gameplay for what it is, rather than what it could be, allows the player to feel like they really have been put in the middle of an intense battle and emphasizes the very natural human limitations of the protagonist. Feeling like a human rather than a superhero while playing a game is a very unique feeling and certainly an exhilarating one. Which isn't to say the player has no powers at their disposal. The amulet from the previous game that allowed Senua to slow down time to take down the more difficult enemies makes a return, and it's equally helpful in the sequel. It's not quite a Rage of Sparta, but it does work in a pinch. Saving it for the right enemy is exceptionally helpful for moderating the difficulty. Of course, the difficulty is only what the player makes of it. The game defaults to a variable mode which changes the challenge dynamically based on the player's inputs. It is intended to help the player, but it does make anticipating the enemy's reactions more difficult due to the subtle changes in the AI subroutines. Thankfully, the difficulty can be changed at any time, and the gameplay flows substantially better as a result. Whatever faults may exist with other elements of the game ultimately make no difference. They all serve the purpose of implementing a breathtaking presentation. Gaming audiences across the world have been waiting 4 years to see a game that truly delivers on UE5's potential, and they finally have it. Senua's Saga HellBlade 2 is easily the best looking console game on the market. Lumen ray tracing, nanite virtual geometry, virtual shadow maps, chaos physics. Everything expected from Epic's latest technology suite makes its mark, and lacks the performance issues associated with prior game releases showcasing the game engine. Anyone who remembers Lumen in the Land of Nanite will definitely feel like this game was made to deliver on the promised quality of that early demo, and it succeeds. So much of the game involves traversing rock faces and steep cliffs, often in constantly changing weather conditions. From a cloudy day to a clear sky, sunrise, thunderstorm, and pitch-black night lit only by fire. The artists take every opportunity to show the player unforgettable sights. Perhaps the most notable of these unforgettable sights is watching the way water behaves. Water that moves and ripples when the player walks through it is not new to video games, but where this game really sets itself apart is with dynamic waves. Watching the way they thrust and dash above the shore, constantly rising and falling in volume, looks like a magic trick. On another occasion, after solving a puzzle, an entire lake drains empty, and watching the way its dimensions shift as it washes beneath the surface evokes a sense of wonder. Not many games make the player feel enchanted, but HellBlade 2 does it with exceptional regularity. Aurora Borealis, beautiful destruction, flawless fog, volumetric lights, dramatic lighting, breathtaking vistas, particle effects. The list goes on and on. In fact, particle effects make the most dramatic difference on the presentation. Yes, the obvious blue sparkles NVIDIA made hullabaloo about during the physics days are here, but ironically on an AMD APU, not an NVIDIA GPU. The most effective use of particle effects are actually in the most subtle ways, with simulated rainfall, dust and tufts of grass catching particularly harsh focus lights, ash from volcanoes, and snow. More than one of these effects are often used at once too, and they're not intended to overwhelm the player, except in those moments where the protagonist comes into contact with the supernatural. And those special blue sparkles punctuate these moments perfectly, in addition to emitting real light. Speaking of light, Lumen and virtual shadow maps do wonders for the mood the game works to communicate. Harsh lights of fire and flashes of thunder are suitably dramatic and really add to those moments where the game's many huge set pieces transpire. Amazing motion capture and facial animation have always been selling points of Ninja Theory's games, but HellBlade 2 marks the first time in history a character in video games becomes indistinguishable from real life. Literally everything about Senua's character model is vividly detailed, from the highlights in her eyes, to the detail of her pores, the thin layers of hair across her bare skin, the scar tissue, the occasional perspiration, the voice acting, and the way her body moves with heaviness and constraint. Comparisons to James Cameron's blockbuster Avatar could easily be made as well. And it's remarkable to think it took video games 15 years to match the photorealism achieved by Weta Digital. The other characters in the game don't animate with quite the same refinement as the protagonists though, and it's sometimes easy to tell. They're a bit stiff. Even so, their animation work is still superior to what is seen in the work of several other larger studios. It's easy to say that stiff is much better than looking unnatural. The way their faces move avoids that unpleasant stroll down Uncanny Valley, sometimes obvious in games made by Bethesda, Activision, or Electronic Arts. And only Naughty Dog has maintained superior quality on its own work on animation. There are only really two failures regarding the game's graphical presentation. The first is with specific moments where fire sprites seem particularly low resolution. The sequence that matches the Xbox gameplay reveal is probably the best moment in the game to observe this phenomenon. The second is pixelization artifacts. Upon first glance, it might seem to be a fault of software-based Lumen and how it handles denoising, but switching to the PC and cycling through the anti-aliasing upscaling options reveals it's actually a consequence of the low input resolution the game is rendering at. Upon further examination, altering the input resolution of the game does very little to terminate these artifacts. Nothing less than native resolution or DLSS can eliminate them. Further analysis of the PC version of the game reveals several other curiosities. Obviously, the PC version allows the player to increase the draw distance, the quality of the foliage, the texture detail, and the post-processing. But these features don't offer any obvious benefit to performance or graphical quality. They're not invisible, they're just not obvious. To really tell the difference, flipping between screenshots of the same scene at 200% zoom is often required. The only notable exception is post-processing, and players who do not like post-processing will definitely want to scale that option to its lowest possible setting to reduce blur effects of the image. Reflections do have a dramatic impact on the look of the game as well, but turning them down is so detrimental that it's almost unthinkable to do so. Keeping them above medium or high is the best option available. Another interesting anomaly is that although the game allows vertical sync on all AA options, the only one that combines with dynamic resolution scaling is TSR, Epic's own proprietary offering on UE5. Choosing TSR will give players the option to aim for any frame rate between 30 to 60 FPS and hold that number. Every other choice from XeSS to DLSS to FSR will manually shift between 24, 30, or 40 frames per second when a steady 30 or 60 cannot be achieved. While this doesn't necessarily make the game harder to play, it does present a challenge for streamers wishing to capture smooth, uninterrupted footage as they broadcast. It's obviously intended to help players who don't have the luxury of variable refresh rate screens, and in that sense, it's an excellent innovation. The option to turn it off for those who don't want jerky recordings would definitely be helpful though. Speaking of jerky recordings, on the PC version, HellBlade 2 suffers from stuttering everywhere, most notably while moving onto new and untraversed areas of the game environment, but also during set-piece moments. The shader pre-compilation step and CPU threads devoted solely to compiling shaders suggest that shader compilation stutter is not the problem. Memory constraints also should not be the problem, nor should CPU bottlenecking. The game offers the player the ability to see whether or not their game exceeds their available pool of video memory, and has been made with low VRAM GPUs in mind. Likewise, the game allows players to examine whether their GPU or CPU is too slow to handle the graphical load as they tweak their settings. Also, theoretically any CPU design post-Zen 2 released by Intel or AMD should exceed the game's CPU requirements. It's really hard to believe that a laptop sporting an i9 12900HX and a mobile RTX 4080 with dynamic resolution scaling enabled would struggle to maintain a solid 30 FPS. It's very distracting and extremely immersion-breaking. Players who have the choice between Xbox and PC should definitely play on Xbox first, so that crucial first experience is not ruined. With all that said, the game truly does deliver on the promised potential of Unreal Engine 5. Even Software Lumen does not break down when rendering in native resolution, and any drawbacks regarding pixelization and reflections are superfluous. No one cared about the out-of-place cube maps in God of War 4, and few will care about the reflection quality in HellBlade 2. Ultimately, HellBlade 2 is a deeply engaging experience. More grounded and tangible than the average Marvel movie blockbuster, but still possessing enough of those fantastic elements to give it much-needed flair. This isn't high fantasy or dark fantasy like Dungeons & Dragons. It is somewhere between The Lord of the Rings and A Song of Ice and Fire in its storytelling genre. It is a very wise choice, giving itself a uniqueness and style that still grips the player. With 7 years passing, though, between the first release and the second, the game's incredibly short length is definitely puzzling. Much like Heavenly Sword, it is a fantastic experience, but not much longer than a few Blu-ray movies. The $50 price tag does make it cheaper than most other mainstream releases, but it's still very hard to imagine spending that sort of money on what amounts to a rental value for gaming. Amazingly, though, this makes the game a perfect inclusion for the growing library on Microsoft Game Pass for Xbox Live and PC. Expense is no longer a barrier to entry, nor a driver of disappointment for whatever expectations players might have. And anyone who really does feel it is worth $50 can choose to spend that money after trying the game for themselves to see for certain. Taking Game Pass into consideration certainly makes the game much easier to recommend. The fact that a subscription service makes the game available on both Xbox or PC definitely overcomes the tension that might be derived from the perceived need to buy a $300 or $500 gaming device. Fans who have been eagerly awaiting a sequel will definitely not be disappointed. And even players who are not fans should not miss out on this breathtaking adventure.